This meeting is being recorded.
All right, welcome everybody to our 7th meeting, I believe. And today we have part 2 for Steve Stesney. Your first part was talking about public affairs use case, and this time you're going to do part 2. I don't know what the content's going to be, but that's what will make it exciting. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions to follow. So with that, I'll hand it off to Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And yeah, as you mentioned, last time I really dug into one specific use case with public affairs and building out the knowledge graph and how they used it and what they were looking to do. In this talk, I want to sort of be a little bit broader and talk about some of the challenges in the use cases from a few different projects that I've worked on recently in the graph space and also just in general sort of the knowledge sharing and collaboration space. So I'll get into some of those and some of the challenges of those. And, I don't have as much material as I did last time. So I hope this one to be a little bit more of a discussion and questions and a collaboration amongst the group here about some of the challenges that are out there specifically with knowledge graph projects, which is my forte, but it also just kind of gets into sort of just how the different groups collaborate and the ways to build these types of solutions for clients that enable some of the cooler things to happen with graph technology. So any thoughts before I sort of dig in here to a couple of different different use cases and different challenges?
Take it away.
Excellent. So one of the, just to speak in general terms here, one of the past projects and clients I've worked with, we were building a system that pulled together a bunch of different materials around learning. And it was really, really interesting because we were working specifically within one group of a very large organization. And within that group, it was very, very, very much of they had a vision, they had an idea, and they knew what they needed to do to try to execute that. And that was to pull together their materials that they knew that they had within the systems in which they controlled to build a proof of concept. And the proof of concept was interesting because they built a basic search and retrieval that would take information, pull it together. They did some metadata analysis. They figured out exactly how to clean that up and to work through that. But once the product and the proof of concept was displayed to others, other groups wanted more information and all those things. So it became sort of a directive that it needed to expand and increase content. And so once it got out of that proof of concept, one of the big challenges that was come across was trying to figure out who were the different data stakeholders for this specific project and content stakeholders as well too. And so one of the bigger challenges that was faced was with the proof of concept, and it was ability to pull back information and retrieve it from 4 or 5 different sources, worked really well. Search worked really well. Then they wanted to integrate more data. There was a different group that wanted to integrate this specific piece of data into it. So it became very, very quickly sort of a proof of concept that things were starting to be attached to. It's really difficult to manage, but also all the different groups were like, we have this data here. And it became trying to figure out who has the data, what are they looking for? And so one of the challenges we have is just figuring out who we need to work with. And not only that, it's then when you specifically find out who you need to work with to get the data and the content, it's also what are they motivated by? What are the challenges that they have? What are the resources that they have? What are the time constraints that they have? And I sort of touched on this last time about with the public affairs firm. And this is something we see in other projects as well too. It's okay, we have this graph, we have this knowledge graph, we're pulling together information, and we want to get this piece of data, or we want to get this data set or data source integrated into it. Start to work with that group, you can identify the data steward, the data owner, and all of that. But then it becomes, it becomes a project in and of itself just to get that person to work specifically, or that group to work specifically to feed that information in. And it becomes very time consuming and very resource intensive. And the challenge that we had in this specific client was that they didn't have the time, the energy, or the resources, or the directive to actually do it. And so it became the process really slowed down. And once we got it sort of outside of that proof of concept and the systems that were able to be, that were able to under control, we started to really become, trying to figure out who the data stakeholders were, what were they motivated by, how do we get their data in. I actually created, in this instance, sort of a data stakeholder mapping spreadsheet, which just where was the data source, who was responsible for, who is the owner, and then also we sort of got into like what were their different motivations behind the data, and how could we use it, and really sort of took a lot of time and effort to really do that, and it really slowed it down. And I think that's one of the challenges, I think, for these types of projects, is setting up those, who are the data stakeholders or the content stakeholders beforehand, and really mapping them out, so that when you're actually getting into the build part of it, and you're actually like, you already have all of that information, and you have a lot of the roadblocks that come with that sort of taken down. If you need upper management or other people to come in and say, hey, look, we need to do this, it's really helpful to make sure that you sort of map out who are your data stakeholders and content stakeholders to begin with, and then look at the roadblocks to getting that information back to you well before you even start building. Because one of the challenges that the different projects I've worked on before is that you build the proof of concept and it's great, and then you start to, you've got development resources and other things ready to go to pull in other data sources, but then you run into a series of challenges with the data and the data stakeholders, and it sort of slows that development process down almost to a crawl, while you go ahead and focus on working on the different data stakeholders and the different information, trying to pull that information back. So that's just just one of the challenges that I worked on, but I want to open it up to the group here for questions and discussion as well.
Yes, Steve, this reminds me of another talk that I listened to from someone who deals with data governance. And the way she described it seems similar in that once you get the stakeholders, how do you get them engaged to participate? And the way she described it was funny, because what she mentioned was, how can I get the stakeholder to understand that what we're doing affects them on what happens on a given Tuesday? In other words, their day-to-day operations, how might this positively impact them on any given day? And that's how she approached it. And I'm curious as to how you incentivize them to understand that, there is some upfront work involved, but yet, there's a positive impact for your participation, whether you're a supplier of the data or consumer or both, or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the approach that you just laid out there. For us in the different projects, it's really about laying out the direct value they will get out of the system. And then, like the example you had, like, well, how is this going to affect you on Tuesday? We would work back a little bit with the different stakeholders and talk to them and really sort of say, what are your business objectives? What are your challenges? What are you looking to achieve? What is your boss or your boss's boss? What are they looking for you to do at? And really try to align what information we were looking for in the data we were looking for with their objectives as well too. So really being able to play out that value that we could provide directly to them, to something that really matched their business, and sort of aligned it so that they could go to their boss and say, like, hey, look, if we devote the resources here, this is what we'll get, and really arming them with those negotiations. That's how we specifically went after. We went after just talking, looking at the business objectives, looking at how we could, help them with that argument, because most people within a different, a large organization, they want to help and they want to, be productive. At the same point, they don't want to be pulled too far away from their own objectives and and what their bonus is based on, and a whole series of other things. And so it's really finding that alignment and being able to find out what those business objectives are that they're concerned about, and then how the product can help alleviate some of those.
And does this go back to senior leadership again about incentivizing the stakeholders, laying the framework for, this is why we're doing it, and this is how it's going to help you as a member of the organization and your group?
Yeah, because I think there's sort of the two levels here, right? There's the execution level. You're looking for the data owners and the data stewards to be able to pull that information that, whether they have a data analyst, whether they have an engineer, they're the person going to be directing that type of the execution. You also need to work on the senior leadership level as well to help them understand that, oh, these are the different groups that you're going to need to work with and incentivize to get this project done. Usually the senior leadership is bought into the overall sort of, with any type of graph project in general, it's a lot of different groups and a lot of different people involved in pulling it together. So usually the senior leadership is bought into the end. Obviously you need to get to that point, but the senior leadership is bought into it. And so then it's working with them to be like, hey, look, we need this specific piece of information or this specific data source, and we're running into a roadblock here. How do we work with you to get, this branch or this team that you oversee to work with us directly, and working with them to sort of work with them directly to really help them understand what the challenge is working with a specific group or a specific team, but also giving them ideas for incentivizing that team or that group to work with you as well too.
And I'm not to dominate the conversation, but one last question. Is there like a spectrum as to how far you go with the POC so that you get the stakeholders to visualize or understand that this is the direction we're going? I mean, you could probably take a POC fairly far, and maybe you don't want to do that, or it's not fleshed out enough where they just don't understand where you're going with it. Is there some rule of thumb there?
I wish there was a rule of thumb. I do not know of one. I really look for the proof of concepts that I really focus in on, really to be tied back to specific use cases, and looking at, taking that proof of concept, meeting that use case, showing and working with others specifically, and showing that logic between here's the business challenge, here's the use case where we focused on, and here's the proof of concept that we've developed. And, a lot of it could just comes down to experimentation and a view from the business is that enough? Is that not enough? And I wish there was a rule of thumb to say, okay, yeah, this is ready to go here, or this is ready to be shifted over here. Some businesses prefer, you get into meetings and they'll be like, oh, this is great. Now show so-and-so, right? And you're like, okay. And so like the different types of business organization structure and culture also affects sort of when that POC comes, to fruition as well too. There's a lot of different factors to that. And I wish I could write a simple rule of thumb, but I don't know if there's ever going to be one in this instance.
I think what you've just described really resonates in terms of an observation that I've made many times. And it's that proof of concepts are rarely designed to scale. They're a quick investigation, right? To prove an idea is initially viable. But what often happens is that people then build out from that rather than designing it to scale in the first place. And that happens either on the technology level or quite often on the organization level as well. And you see, particularly on the organization side, people are not quite sure what their contribution really is to that. They're not sure what their responsibility is in seeing that delivered. And I'm thinking particularly around things like the people who work as data stewards. They're often almost the people who seem to be caught in the no man's land in the middle of between two things. And it strikes me as almost a little bit of an embodiment of that Metcalfe law that we I think spoke of one or two episodes back, where it's the range and number of communication points as you start to try and scale that out to different bodies starts to become just a mess. People again, they're often at cross purpose, not because they're competing with each other, but because they haven't really got that alignment that they need in order to bring it together. And of course, you know, the traditional response to that is, of course, governance and architecture and all those sorts of things. And that's the very first thing that starts to, you know, weigh those folks down. And, you know, they just don't want that extra administrative burden, if you like. And so, I really do sense a degree of resonance in the sense that, you know, it seems to be a very common problem, but yet we don't really have the real patterns to be able to go with a degree of reliability to say, if we do it this way, then the outcome is going to be X, Y, Z. It just doesn't happen.
Right. I completely agree. And also what you said a few minutes ago really struck me. And, you know, the proof of concept becomes, you know, what they try to scale. And, you know, I've been in situations before where the proof of concept is done and it meets the business case, and that's great. But then when you come back and say, well, actually, we, you know, in order to scale it, we need to pull it back down, rework it and all that. And the view from the other side of the table is why? Like, why are we spending money tearing it all down and rebuilding it? You know, when you go into arguments of scale and all that, you're basically back to square one. Basically, like, hey, look, we have something here, but we need to build it completely different. And then, you know, the question becomes, well, why did we build it this way in the first place? So it becomes this difficult argument. I think it's a lot easier for organizations just to say, well, let's just put this system in, let's just do that. And then they don't really want to go back and do that alignment, that understanding of, okay, now this is something different. And we're building it out to scale, because I think you're right. I don't think there are those systems or those processes or those thought processes in place within organizations to be able to pull it all together.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues there is that there's we hear quite often that people are willing to, shall we say, fail fast.
Right.
But that's a proof in itself that actually that mindset doesn't really translate into the actual operation. It's more, yeah, we would like to do that, but when it comes down to it, we don't really, because we're not prepared to go back to that square one. We feel that we have to build on what we've already done. And if we do fail, then it's an incremental failure rather than a, what did we really learn so that we can do this right? And I think that's the difference.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think even with the sort of that fail fast mentality, is you're just in with the proof of concept, it's like, yeah, it works. Okay, let's add something else. Let's add something else until you fail or it doesn't work anymore. But then you've sunk a lot of money and a lot of time and effort into it. And the failures become, well, let's just try something else, and not really learning about, you know, what may have actually been the root cause of the failure, which could have been 5 or 6 steps back.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Yes, Steve, it's Eric. Just a quick question. When you think about going from POC to MVP or something in production, there's usually a big gap, as you've kind of highlighted. One of the things to addressing that gap is what I call socialization. Internal sales and marketing, I suppose, to use that term. But many times us technology folks kind of move away from that. But what I found is if you've done something worthwhile and you don't sell it and market, it's kind of like the proverbial tree that falls in the forest. If nobody saw it, did anybody hear it? So tell me a little bit about kind of your thoughts around, you know, what steps would you suggest can be taken around socialization, sales, marketing, internal, obviously, that might move from POC to MVP quicker?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I'm a firm believer in socialization, especially with the POCs that come out of specifically one group or one domain. I've seen in multiple projects where it's usually one group that has an idea of, if we pull together these 5 or 6 data sources, we can really build something really cool. But they don't know how to build it. So they call in, you know, a group that I like, you know, that I work for, like Predictive UX or others, and we help them build it and we help them get them there. And then, you know, there needs to be a whole sort of internal marketing and sort of advertising, you know, sort of discussion that needs to happen internally. And I also think too that one of the challenges is that people build the POC and then they start to socialize it. We found actually, so for us, one of the steps that we take is that we start that socialization process early. So when we initially come into an engagement and we identify the data sources and the initial proof of concept, we start to work with the client directly to say, hey, look, what other groups do you think? And there's a lot of sort of hidden information that people have that, doesn't come quite out, in sort of the normal sort of data investigations and data discovery. It's like, oh, I know so-and-so over there in HR, and they've got this really interesting thing that, data source or something. And so like, okay, so with that, what we do is you really try to lay out, like, who are the people who are we going to talk to as we're building the proof of concept, and to talk them and socialize them about sort of what we're building, what kind of value we're bringing, and how we could potentially work together once the proof of concept gets further along, and sort of bring them on. So we find it vital to bring in those different groups. And we do ask sort of questions to our sort of the main client or the main stakeholder that we're working with, to really talk them through that, to make sure that, okay, who else do we need to be talking to? Then also we work specifically with the group that we're working with to arm them with different information about, hey, look, this is in this example, for example, like, this is a knowledge graph. This is what it does, this is how it does, this is how it's specifically going to help this group here. And, into then we work with them then to socialize that as well amongst their peers, whether it be other directors, whether it be senior directors, whether it be executives, so that also helps. So by the time the proof of concept comes along, people understand sort of what the challenge is that they were trying to achieve, what are the other opportunities within the organization, and then they can actually see it working, is, to me, the really crucial step. I find a lot of people in sort of the different, they go into sort of proof of concept building mode, like, oh, we're going to build it, we're going to pull it all together, and then they just start showing people, and that's okay. But I find that there needs to be a lot of sort of foundational layering on that, to make sure that when that situation comes, that people have already thought through what it is, what it can do, and how they could potentially help, and what other data sources and what other things could be there to make that conversation more fruitful. Because I think if you do this specific proof of concept with the specific use case, and I've seen executives say, this is great and interesting, but I don't see how that applies. You want to get this, you want to sort of circumvent that thought process so that that doesn't happen, right? They're already thinking about it, and that we can move it along a little quicker. That's what we found to be most successful for us in socializing and getting that proof of concept to MVP, and also just greater buy-in.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions?
I have a question about, taking fair data principles and sort of getting those into the operations of an organization, such that when you start a proof of concept or people have a project they want to work on, it's not so hard to actually just, clean and find and sort the data that you want. So do any of these projects seem to sort of leave a paper trail of fair principles that the data is easier to access and use next time around, or is that just too much for the scope of the projects?
So that actually brings up an excellent question, and actually talks about one of my other sort of points to discuss, and that's how much different type of principles, how many different types of organization, like processes, like dealing with different type of data and the legal aspects of it, and the presentation and the governance and all of that all goes into building graph databases. And I think there's a tremendous misalignment between when a group starts a proof of concept and what they understand to be the governance or the different principles associated with the data, as to what can actually be achieved. I think one of the challenges that corporate organizations run into is that once they start to do the different, look at things like that, and obviously you want to, as you create it, you want to make it findable, you want to make it, all of that. But I also too, I think, from a proof of concept standpoint, the amount of time and effort that's put into that, I mean, as we talked about a few minutes ago, is that, you're trying to be quick, you're trying to show the value. I think that the type of the different types of sort of priorities and sort of the data and all that, that should go sort of secondary once you're starting to build out an MVP, which could potentially scale into production. So that's sort of where I see that fitting more. And I find that in the proof of concept realm, there's a lot of things that can slow down. And one of those is just the data investigations, talking to the different departments, like the legal department, about specific data and all of that. And you have to be very, very careful and very, very targeted in the data that you're looking for. Otherwise, you can get bogged down really, really quickly in other stuff in order to get your proof of concept off the ground. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And I was, as you're starting to describe this, I had a metaphor come to mind, and I wanted to share it just in case this is accurate or not, because I think it gets at the incentives of the people involved and the stakeholders. So I was imagining sort of a Serengeti plain picture here, right, where your team was a bunch of cheetahs who actually took down the zebra, right? They had their proof of concept, their project succeeded. And then they're left with this situation of sort of the vultures of the organization all now descend on the carcass of their zebra, right? And they all want a piece of it. And so, it's trying to figure out, like, why are the vultures hungry? Like, why is there this appetite for all this food all of a sudden? Why are they here, right? And their incentives about sort of taking down the zebra, they didn't take down the zebra, right? They had nothing to do with that, right? But now suddenly all of their appetites have been sort of, uncovered. And you're left with this organization of chaos, where everyone's like, who's in charge here, right? Like, and who owns this thing, and who has a right to it, and what are we using it for? So I think I don't know if that's a helpful analogy, but it kind of just gets at the chaos maybe of we're trying to analyze a situation which is not controlled, right? This is not a zoo with zookeepers where the lions and the zebras are separate from, the vultures and the birds, right? Where everyone gets fed, right? Like someone's managing it all. Everyone's got their little enclosure and they get their food they need every day. Instead, we have this sort of wild Serengeti plain situation that we're trying to break down and analyze and control. But it's kind of by nature an uncontrolled situation, or a wild environment, right?
Yeah, and I think the last part of that is, the uncontrolled nature of it. That's part of it. I mean, one of the projects I worked on was that, the proof of concept was well received by one group, and they said, "This is great, this is fantastic. How can I help?" But another group said, basically, like, and unbeknownst to us was that the budget for the proof of concept had come out of their budget, basically. And so, it became infighting, and it became, all of a sudden this different, all of these different motivations were driving people to view the proof of concept in a specific way, that it became virtually uncontrollable. And there was no way to sort of rectify that unless you sort of went through sort of like organizational cultural change. And so, there are that instances where with the proof of concept, you sort of, you get it out there and you start to socialize it. And sometimes you don't know how people are going to take it and where it fits within their mental map and their operational processes and how they're going to approach it. And so that's I think it's a pretty good analogy. Any other thoughts, questions? Excellent. And just to sort of build on my response from a second ago, in building out different graph projects, you almost become sort of data investigators, right? Content investigators, like, where is this data? What are you looking for? The large misalignment, I think, in a lot of organizations about what data they have and what data is available. And this really slows down the development process quite heavily, because you'd be talking to a senior executive and they'll say, "Oh yes, we have this data," or "Yeah, sure, look over here, talk to so-and-so. They have, this information over here." You go and you talk to so-and-so and they're like, "Yeah, we don't actually have that data. We don't own that data. We actually license the data." So there's a lot of things that go into, trying to find the data that really extend the time and really need a lot of effort up front to make sure that, the data sources that you're looking for, once you specifically step outside of sort of your core data sources, are available, are accessible, actually contain the data that people think it contains, and that data is, whether it's, purchased or licensed from other sources, if it's not first source, who owns that, who owns the rights to that data. There's a lot of things that need to be investigated. And, sort of as you go also through the proof of concept MVP, it's like, oh, let's just put in this data source, or let's just do that. And there's a lot of misalignment between what people really understand to be in the data sources and also their ability to use that data. And, it takes, that also slows down, once you start to go outside. And so that collaboration issue, because you have to bring in things like the subscriptions group and the legal group and oh, well, what about the contract for this? And, when is that contract up? Well, it's up in 2 years. Well, are we going to retain that? Are we going to maintain that data? So it's a very, very complicated situation once you start to do that. And then, I find that the misalignment is quite stark in a lot of organizations.
Do you find that one of the points of misalignment is that people confuse data with information?
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, it's like they see it on a dashboard, right? And they see, oh, we have, this specific metric. We must have this specific data. It's like, and the tough answer is, and maybe not, like, right, where is the data behind it? What is the information being produced? And there is a big gap there.
Mm.
Have you
Any other
seen
thought?
organizational efforts to just get a better handle on the data? I mean, the FAIR principles in that, where you don't start at a proof of concept, you start as an organizational sort of philosophy of, hey, we want better access and data flow and shareability within the organization. And that becomes the focus versus starting with the small, narrow proof of concept, but taking a bigger vision, step back, right, and say, what do we really need here to make all of this work better? Or is that just too big of a sell?
I think that's the challenge, right? Like, how big of a sell are you going to go into that? And I think, not to say that we take the easy way out, but the proof of concept, we're working within a small group within a large organization, is a much easier route to take. And trying to sell the overall, hey, look, this is your organization, this is how data can affect the value, and that's a really big sell to do that, and to have those relationships. And it really has to be driven by the top level of executives. All have to be on board with that, because there's a lot of, as we all know, there's a tremendous amount of data, even in the smallest of organizations. There's a lot of value that can be driven out of that data. And most companies only scratch the surface of it, but data affects every single, the sort of the people, processes, technology aspects of companies, as and data is integrated into every single one of those. And we need to really figure out, in order to do the sort of the overall company thing, it's a massive endeavor that I think people just shy away from.
Do you find that you invariably have to do at least some sort of data maturity assessment before you can proceed and know how to?
Oh yeah.
Even though you're starting off where we're going to do a proof of concept and it's not really in scope, and in fact, it really is in some ways.
It is. And we do in all of our engagements, we do some sort of data maturity. It may depend upon, it may be small, right? Like even if the proof of concept pulls together like 3 different sources, most likely all 3 sources are not at the same level. So, it's, you have to go through sort of the data quality, the completeness of the data, but then also the data maturity, but also looking also to it sort of the cultural aspects of some of the data systems as well too, and that all needs to be a part of it. Now, for smaller projects, that may not be a big part. That may be a smaller part, but it needs to be understood by the business, so that they can grasp at an understanding of where they're at with, whether it be 2 or 3 systems or 20 systems. They need to understand that, and I find the data maturity model to be really helpful in sort of getting them an understanding of where they're at, and sort of giving them the baseline metrics to sort of move forward.
So what do the utopian stakeholders look like, if you've ever encountered you can imagine, like, going into an organization and all the ducks are lined up? What does that look like?
I think a sort of a utopian situation from an organizational standpoint would be sort of a data culture that really understands and respects the data that the organization has, and an understanding that, you know, working with the data as an organization and with business objectives can really drive value. And I think that's really what it takes from an executive level, of that just general buy-in, that the work that they're doing on the data level and, you know, sort of the foundational layers of some of their data infrastructure will yield results. And that there is an actual sort of end goal of what they're trying to work towards. It may never be achievable, but to work with the data, to understand it has value, and to be able to put the resources necessary behind those internal projects to really drive the company forward through data. And that would really be sort of the utopian understanding for me, that I think from a, from a outside would be wonderful to have. And then that hopefully could flow down into the different levels within the organization, so that, you know, there's that level of, you know, this is our data, this is what we're doing with this is the value that we're providing, and it becomes a top priority for everybody underneath the executive level.
Interesting. And to go back to the Serengeti analogy, some people are writing that those are the only types of organizations that are going to survive in the next 20 years. Do you agree? Or there's still those that are a little confused as to how to get the most out of their information?
I don't know. I think that the challenge ongoing right now is that there are the organizations that are focused on data and pulling that data together and all of that. But I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge. I don't think there's going to be sort of in 20 years, you know, companies that aren't leveraging their data are going to go by the wayside. I think it's going to be a slow death for them. But I do think that there will be new organizations. I think, however, that the overall data challenges that are faced are just mammoth and just huge, and more data is being created every day. New systems are being added, and people are adding on systems and, you know, retiring other systems, and it's just a general lack of how we're, you know, from an organizational standpoint, how are you using data? What's our overall plan? And I think that, you know, it's sort of a utopian vision that, oh yeah, you know, there's a company now that uses its data and, you know, they're gonna achieve success. And yeah, they may be more efficient and they may do that, but I think it's a really broad challenge. And I think there's still so much to be done on the data world and really affecting the data culture, so that companies can really be, you know, use their data to create value. I think there's just so much work to be done there on that front. I don't think that, you know, even if a company gets out to the, you know, in a specific industry with data and they go there, that doesn't mean other people can't catch up. This just means that other organizations can't catch up. It's just that it's just going to take a lot to really transition their full culture around data.
Yeah. I wonder in 20 years if, you know, whether it's technology or the sociological side that's going to win over, because on one side, I think there's going to be technology that's going to facilitate the sharing of data. But as we all know, that's incomplete. It's never the whole equation. And I also look at my kids, they have higher expectations, you know, in terms of like, this should just happen. Whereas in my generation, it definitely was not the case. We weren't thinking in those terms. So I wonder if just the expectations of future generations will put them in alignment with this utopian, as close as possible, this utopian kind of ideal, save for human nature itself, that's always going to be pulling back.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, I think you're right. I think it's definitely a cultural change that'll continue to happen, because I have a 12 and a 14-year-old as well too. And, you know, how they use technology and what they expect out of technology is far different than than how I use it. And, you know, imagining them in, you know, 10, 15 years from now, and how they're using, you know, data and all that, I think you're right. I think there is going to be, you know, some really big cultural shifts as well too, from the expectations that'll come from, or that the people expect from organizations. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I think my observation is that the social side of it will become more accepting. It will foster more integration, more collaboration. But the expectation on the technology is it will just work, utility style.
Right.
And whilst in some respects we do have some of those capabilities, we still don't have it as a ubiquitous capability. And I think that's where the big challenge is going to lie for us, because there's a disconnect between that future expectation and where we are today. And we'll have to close that gap somehow. And if I use some of the younger generation who are in my circle, they don't care how that technology actually works. They just want it to work. And I think that's something that we have to really work to make happen.
Yeah, I know. I was chatting with my son a couple weeks ago about something, and he mentioned something about a technology. I think it was an ad serving technology, and I was like, "Well, this is how it works," and he didn't care. You know, like, whatever. He's like, "Whatever. They're not serving me the right ad." I was like, "Okay." I was like, "Well, it's because of this, and this is how this works." And he's like, "No, I don't really care." I'm like, "Okay, well, and to me, I find that fascinating because I grew up with that and understanding, how they have made it all work. But yeah, that expectation of it just needs to work is going to be quite prevalent.
Yeah.
So in some ways, graph-based technologies are quite good for that, because somehow half of the way why they are successful is also because they have a very natural way of understanding and illustrating to a person what's going on. Because in some way you can have a lot of different AI processes that do a lot of things, but a graph somehow is something tangible. People kind of think they understand what's going on, which helps on all stakeholder levels in some way.
Oh yeah, I firmly agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've always been, for like 5 or 7 years, focused on graph and graph projects. It makes a lot of things that are intangible very, very tangible very, very quickly, and being able to see how things are laid out, and also how it relates to the mental models that people have in their mind too about how things work. And yeah, I think that's one of the keys of graph technology is that alignment.
And it's an excellent aggregator, right? Because what you're able to do is you're able to not only bring overlapping ideas together, but you can actually also bring competing ideas together. And that's obviously really the focal part of the earlier argument and discussion, which was around, the fact that you've got these competing teams within an organization, or even across different organizations, that are trying to work out how to best deliver their piece of the jigsaw. And sometimes they're at odds, sometimes they're in alignment, and sometimes they're just trying to figure stuff out. And I think, the graph technology is perhaps one of the best that we've had, certainly to date, in terms of being able to bring those different worlds together, being able to synthesize different views, get up to the information level, which is, that's a personal bugbear of mine, trying to get people to see things on an information level, rather than just the data, because sometimes they're not one and the same.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I definitely see graph eventually assuming, sort of the main infrastructure piece in that sort of intelligence level of information level. And you can have, like you said, you can have competing parts of the organization, driving their business and being very successful, but also feeding information into that information level that overall helps the business grow. And so you can, continue to instill that competition. It's not like everybody has to work together all the time. It's, if you have, depending upon the industry and what you're in, but if businesses over here, want to, really work efficiently and focus in on that, that's great. They can then feed the specific data points into that graph level, and it works tremendously well. And I think that is eventually, I think, as organizations, continue to evolve in their infrastructure, there's going to be that information level. And I do, I firmly believe that it's going to be the infrastructure behind that. It's going to be the graph technologies behind it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, these past few minutes of discussion are interesting, because it seems to me that if you're part of an industrial revolution, so to speak, like, technology, like we have been, you find it hard to see past the brick and mortar. And I think maybe that's where graph will take, hold with folks that have higher expectation, meaning future generations and how they see things. Sometimes it's hard sometimes success is the biggest shackle you could put on yourself. And we've had success in building things out in this generation, and perhaps future generations see that as an impediment. Today's success is a future impediment, and that lends itself better to this ideal of global knowledge sharing, whereas we're still stuck in organizational bubbles.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that we are. I mean, and still, there's still a tremendous amount of challenges just in the sort of the organizational data of flow and understanding that and the information within organizations. So, I think we're going to be stuck in that realm for a while.
This really resonates with me around the integration of data and information, or the interface, if you will, if they are different things structurally. But so my interests are really in unifying those structurally, so that you had a model for data that was capable of being a model for information, and I would add was even capable of being a model for wisdom, or go beyond information into knowledge, which is essentially like you can assert information that's sort of coherent, intelligible to people, but you still don't know what's true. And I think with some of the emerging large language model uses, we're entering an era where enterprises are going to be overwhelmed with information now, right? People can generate ChatGPT documents that look like very convincing, as we're really talking about some good information here, but where's the knowledge in all of that? Do we have the capabilities within that model to actually judge true and false, right? And understand the true meaning, not just of information, but of what is the knowledge in that? So, I think the answer is, and what I'm working on is an integrated model for data, information, and knowledge all in one spectrum, right? All at one time, handle all of that at once. And if you're able to sort of, I guess the question here from the organizational discussion is how would you introduce such an idea to an organization? Because it is such a different step back. Hey, let's take a big look at the whole picture, instead of, hey, these are the people that understand what to do with the data. These are the people that want to deal in information and knowledge. But there's this wall of separation in that their systems don't talk to each other. Their models don't talk to each other. So what's your thoughts on that? Yeah.
That's a big question. I mean, your work sounds fascinating, and I think it's, I don't know where organizations are. From the ones that I've worked on, they seem like they'd be pretty far away from that. And so I'd love to just hear more about what you think about that.
The flip use case that I see in this is the preservation of organizational knowledge too, because you have experts within an organization, and there's no real good format, right? Just for capturing that type of knowledge, explicit, like I know the answer to that question, right? Can I capture this employee's answer to that question and compare it to other employees and how they answer that question, and create a knowledge base that's actually representative of what we know as an organization, right? Because I think there's huge value in that as people move in and out of organizations. The organization wants to retain its knowledge. So, I mean, it's turning everything upside down, and instead of working from the data up, it's starting at the organizational knowledge and going down. But again, what's missing is the model for all of that, right? How do you integrate all of our sales data with what the salespeople know, and like actually show that in one dashboard, right? Make it some information that's presentable, that actually quickly and fluidly draws conclusions from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, the public affairs firm that I worked for before, one of their biggest challenges was, and also just in general public affairs, is that the associates, they'll work for 2 or 3 years, and then they'll leave, and they'll go to a different firm, and there's a lot of transition, and there's a lot of institutional knowledge that comes and goes. And so how do you capture that? I mean, they went the route of creating and capturing all of the sort of the artifacts that were left over from campaigns, right? Who did they contact? Who did they work with? And we built a knowledge graph off of that data. But there wasn't the top-down approach to, capturing the knowledge of the individual while they're specifically there, or like you say, answering questions and all of that. And that would be, I think something like that would be very, very interesting. It's just a question of how would you get the organizational buy-in to do that.
And I think probably the way you would want to go is actually give them tooling that let that knowledge worker do their job. And in the process of doing their job, you were just passively collecting their knowledge, right? So that knowledge capture became part of the tools that they used to do their job, and therefore it remained with the organization after they left. That's how you'd want to do it. You wouldn't want to have to sort of create a parallel universe that's now representing everything that's going on over there, but you would want to embed the tooling into how they do their work.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, you could capture the different work products and the different, application data that they're using to be able to do that.
I think that would require a reasonably comprehensive model to be able to capture the full range of knowledge and experience that I think what you're looking to sort of build on from there. Graph technologies to me suggest that that potential exists to be able to maybe do that at some point. And the other element that I think graph affords that we don't see in other technologies, or if we do, it's only in sporadic form or limited form, and that is the ability to build consensus on what is considered to be valuable and correct. So it's being able to capture that extra dimension. I don't think we've really had that before, and I think that's where we have opportunity to also be able to challenge the rise of the likes of the ChatGPT, because of course that's volume, isn't it? You can actually throw huge amounts of volume of that generated content, but it doesn't mean that it's correct. It just means that you just got a huge volume, and you need some way of being able to differentiate the truthiness or the correctness of that as it's applied in that organization or cross-organization context. I don't know what the answer is, but I think this is the sort of technology that takes us in the right direction.
I agree. And I think, specifically if you're looking at, the ChatGPT and other types of technical large language models, right? You have organizations that have a lot of data, some of it wrapped up in Excel spreadsheets, all that, but you can use extraction technologies to pull that data out, put that into a graph, into a graph model, and identify the entities and the names. But then you could take those entities and those names or those organizations and whatever labels are specifically within the graph and throw them into, a large language model to build contextualization around that based on all of the artifacts that an organization may have. So they could have, hundreds of documents, and, you're able to sort of extract it out, put it into a knowledge graph, run that information back through the large language model to build out this amazing contextual understanding of information. So you could take a person and say, hey, look, do we know this person, or where have we worked with this person? And that search technology I find to be, from an enterprise level, and being able to sort of execute that type of model would be tremendous, because it would allow organizations to apply large language models to the content that they already have to build the context around the information they're searching for now. Organizations look for past proposals. They look for, have we worked with this person before? They're looking for, hey, look, did we do this? I remember writing this 4 years ago. Where is that? Or like I had a question the other day. We need an example of this specific type of information. Okay, going back and finding that information. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there with large language models and graph technologies, but also sort of the extraction technologies that are available as well too, the NLP and other stuff to really build that sort of enterprise level search, which would be extraordinarily effective for enterprises.
Yeah, and I think that the answer to kind of maybe not the answer, but what Phil's describing sort of we would need is really sort of a knowledge graph that had sort of Bayesian network capabilities to it, right? So that you could take a stated model of knowledge and then lay another layer on that, an embedding, if you will, of statistical results, such that, we voted, so to speak, on this piece of knowledge, and this is how certain we are about its truth. It's 50% certain, right? So the problem is, I think that semantic web kind of can do the stated explicit knowledge piece, and neural networks and large language models can do the statistical piece, but we really don't have the hybridization of those two, where you have a stated model with now a statistical overlay that's saying this is the weights on all of our statements of knowledge. And I think that's what it will look like, I think, is some sort of hybridization of the two technologies that we have. It's just the marriage of the two that we really need.
Yeah. Interesting.
There are interesting approach. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to say there are interesting approaches in exactly this hybrid field there, and some aspects for which there are solutions. And so, for example, there are a few people and a number of groups combining Bayesian networks with knowledge graph type reasoning. The other aspect where some progress is being made is on the side of bringing together neural network-based reasoning with knowledge graph-based reasoning, either in the direction of injecting knowledge from a knowledge graph into a neural network model, or the other way around, using in deductive reasoning such models. And this kind of neurosymbolic interaction is it's very interesting to see the field develop in this direction. So I think that's probably one of the most interesting directions our field is currently working on, and that includes large language models, which are, of course, a great hype, but also quite important type of data. It's clear that language is an important type of data. And both the Bayesian, so the statistical one, basically this Bayesian networks over knowledge graphs is very interesting, as well as the neural network type integration. Looking forward to see how it will develop over the next years.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic.
Fascinating to hear that it's already happening.
A lot of what's curious to me is that I built a big data library with a lot of different data sets in it. And we started essentially linking the data sets where they made sense on a geographic and a topical level. This happened years ago, and one of the things that came out of it is kind of the same thing that came out of service-oriented architectures, in that we built a service-oriented architecture because the same data back in created a proliferation of interfaces depending on the need. And every audience seemed to have different needs. So it seems to me that there isn't one integration between knowledge and information to data. There's a plethora of them. And I'm not, how do you, what I've always done is try to build a certain number of interfaces that I thought were represented. And then I made it very easy for others to build their own interfaces, so that you'd have a plethora of knowledges answering different kinds of questions. Now, the idea of a large language model sounds really interesting. Again, it'll tend to give you one type of answer. I don't know how nuanced it'd be, or how much you'd understand the outlier questions, because by definition it's going to move toward the concentration of the average. So it's this whole issue of how do I construct my data infrastructure to solve as many needs as possible is still an intriguing one. So I'm curious what you guys might say, considering there seems to be a consensus.
But the one, I guess, surprising premise that I drew from in trying to integrate data, information, knowledge was to fix the schema. Was not to have a more expressive schema, was to have a more fixed schema, so that you from a computational standpoint, you made it finite, and then you made it expressive, instead of just going right at expression as we're going to have Wild West. people can say whatever they want to and have a very flexible data model. You do the exact opposite thing. You have a very fixed data model that's abstractly fixed, but expressive of all the things that we want to do at the level of data, information, and knowledge. So you need to represent truth. You need to represent more than just the data, the fact. You need to make it something that's actually semantically expressible about the facts, and then you can validate those expressions as true or false. And then you get sort of the full integration, and you do all that with a fixed schema, a fixed graph schema, essentially.
So
that was the approach I'm pursuing. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I hear correctly, then you're saying that really that we need a closed world rather than an open world.
You need a model that can express both closed worlds and open worlds and be explicit about when you're doing each. Yeah, you need both capabilities. It's just you need to understand the difference. Be explicit about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the idea that the models need to be concise and well understood. I think one of the problems that we have with models in general, even at the lower layers, is they tend to be very often quite sprawling, and in some ways they're actually quite brittle because of it, because they don't have some of those higher level abstractions that kind of bring that world into a much more sort of concise definition. And I think some of the lower level concerns are hampered by that particular problem.
And when I hear this, I think about examples where you have this finite kind of finite set of things, sort of like the Roman alphabet or DNA, and you can recompose them into any number of things that you need to express. That kind of composability seems to be pervasive in systems that can adapt to ever-changing requirements. So it sounds good.
No, that's exactly it. And the evidence is right in front of us. Look how much expression there is in the world of biology, and that all of it somehow comes back to, like 4 base pairs in DNA. That's kind of mind-boggling, but it's right in front of us that that's the way to do it, right? It's a fixed schema that becomes highly expressive because it's iterative. And DNA, protein, those are all great examples of exactly how this happens, and we see the diversity that results.
Yeah.
Or as I like to think about the alphabet, 26 letters.
Right.
And it expresses so much.
I suppose the key takeaway from those analogies is the first is the degree of complexity that each one introduces, and then the second is the volume of scale before you get up to that level of expression that we probably find useful, and that to me feels like we're in a completely different order of magnitude than we already are.
Yeah.
No, I agree. That's a concern. I think the meaning actually emerges at a fairly early level, though, in complexity. That is reassuring in some respects to that concern, but it's a valid concern.
Veronica, I know you got some thoughts that you'd like to share. Not to call you out, but you had a good comment this morning on LinkedIn. I'm sure there's something on this topic that stirs your imagination.
Yeah, I'm mostly occupied with the social aspects of this, especially within data sharing. There's we are in this phase of an industrial revolution, perhaps, where we have these old models of distributing burden and gain. For instance, I'm thinking very specifically about the budgeting processes in public sector agencies, where the budget is allocated for one part of the organization, but the gain when data sharing might end up in another part of the organization, or even a different organization. So I think we are at this point where we need to rethink our basic concepts around who is both very basic social things like trust and who is to invest and who is to profit from what we are doing. These kinds of things are need to be addressed, I think. And we in our technology world, we have a tendency to ignore them, but I think they will affect how we work, and we have to support them. That is one thing. The other comment I had to when we were talking about the young people and their expectations, and that they just expect things to run smoothly. I think that's true, but I also think there's an advantage when things don't run smoothly, because it forces them to think where the data comes from, who has created the data. Was there some special purpose behind it? Is it an honest production of data, or is it for a manipulative purpose? All those kinds of things, I think, can play a role. So when it comes to ChatGPT, I see it with my son. He's 11 years old. It's much easier for him to see that when you Google traditionally, right, you get the list of links. It's much easier for him to see that this is produced somehow by a machine and not by a human being. So you have to think more closely about what you are reading here. Whereas with the natural language text that is produced by those large language models, you don't have this effect of, in German you would call Verfremdung, where there's this gap between what you're being presented is not human, right? List of links is not like a human would speak, but the text which is produced by the large language models resembles very much human talk, right? So it's much easier to just trust and not think by yourself. So I think a certain degree of, how do you say, non-smoothness is helpful, because it makes you more awake of what you're looking at. So those are the two thoughts I have been thinking of while listening to you.
Yeah, now that's an excellent counterpoint, actually. Yeah, it's never.
Yeah, friction.
Friction. Friction is the right word. Yeah.
And whilst we often try to work the other way, try to get things to work smoothly, I think you're absolutely right. That friction is the thing that really gets us to think. And even if I use my own son as an example, he likes things just to work. But it's very interesting that point that you raise is the first thing that, when he encounters that problem, that's when he starts to mistrust. That's when he's asking the question, why? Because I've found that even though that sort of generation kind of expects things just to work, I think that there is a degree of mistrust that perhaps is a little bit stronger than we take notice of in that generation. In other words, I think they're more savvy than sometimes they give the impression that's otherwise.
Perhaps I'm too pessimistic, but I just see, I can observe how this tricks him into believing more than thinking him by himself. So, and the other thing, I also am wondering whether in 20 years' time, people will be more data literate, so that's easier for them to think about where the data needs to come from someplace and is generated someplace. So that's also a hope I have, that people are more aware that data doesn't just fall from the sky, but is produced in a certain context for a certain purpose. So
I would hope so, but don't you think like growing data illiteracy is also a risk here? I'm thinking about my children, both of them now, who are obviously very comfortable with technology, but they can't print anything to a printer because it involves plugging their laptop with a USB cord, right? And then having to download some drivers and know how to install those and like the settings to select to change your default printer. And it's funny, they just want things to work. Like they expect everything to be easy. And when it's not, like they are illiterate now on sort of like how to use the control panel in Windows, right? Because they moved away from that. So I feel like there is this risk that we're actually like covering over now the knowledge that people actually need to solve problems. And now it's harder to get to actually the inner working. Like people talk about, you know, the old cars before they were all electronic. You could get in there and work on the carburetor now, you know, because you could see it and understand it. It was all there and sort of like still at a simple level. Now that the digital car has gotten so complex that you don't dare touch anything under the hood, right? It's like connected to everything else and you don't know how. I think there's a very real risk that like the future generations will be sort of trapped in this you know, lack of power and knowledge to actually like do things without like problems that seem unsurmountable to them.
As a developer of the data web, which linked together all the government data sources, one of my great hopes and goals was to increase data literacy, and I was very, very much frustrated. I ended up realizing that people don't care about data; they just want answers. And in between an answer and the data is information, potentially knowledge. It's just this information stack, so to speak. And ethically and morally, what would really please me is if knowledge graphs would increase the friction, increase the incentives for people to ask why, to be more critical thinkers, you know, rather than just seeing a 15-second thing on TikTok and realizing that's the way the world works. It'd be really wonderful if we built things so there's enough transparency and somehow incentives so that, and even in a business sense, do you really trust these sales numbers? What's behind them? Can I drill down? And can we implicitly use technology to teach critical thinking in terms of data? That would be a wonderful outcome.
I'm very much with you. That's my biggest concern, I think. Now we are speaking philosophy, but the critical thinking and this little piece of mistrust you really need to have in order to or the thinking by yourself simply. And I also think that graph technology can help us with this because it puts the entirety on your table, so you can see for yourself. You can see patterns and odd things and odd connections. So
contradictions, which are important.
Well, and the model needs to support that drill down capability, which like the chat GPT, you know, you can ask a follow-up question, but there's no footnotes. There's no like, oh, you know, click on that word. Where did that come from, right? What's the source for that little claim? And at least so far, it's not there. I wonder as these products move forward, if they will include more of the sort of behind the scenes. But my fear is that it's hidden within the model that you know, the explainability of AI needed in healthcare or law, for instance, just not being there. I don't think that's changed at all by sort of maybe made the problem worse that we have solutions that give us answers, but we've lost that ability to drill down, right? Which is going to be essential. I think graph models give you that capability to drill down if the graphs are meaningful, but you know, a vector graph, it's not really human meaningful, right? We don't really know why that weight, what that weight particularly means in relation to all the inputs and outputs in that neural network.
But you know, even if we do have that capability and the tooling to support that, are we at that point though where people just take the first thing that's on offer? And is that the problem? Because actually, we're finding that people either haven't the time or the inclination to ask that why, because it's easy, it's off the shelf, and then move on to the next question that's off the shelf rather than go for the drilling.
There's a psychological issue that's biological, and that is that we hate cognitive dissonance. And so people take they take the path of least resistance. And morally, can we invent incentives behavioral incentives that encourage people to drill down, to look at the contradictions and weigh them. You know, that it's very difficult because there's a lot of literature out that, you know, when you have too many choices, dissidents go up so much that your sales go down. So you want it easy to think about, and yet you have the situation where the supreme intelligence, the robot, has all the answers, and we have no idea how it came up with it. And you know, that's a trend, that making information transparent like you would in a graph might facilitate an alternative.
There's also something that's called the convenience trap. Once you're used to like ordering your pizza on your smartphone, it's really annoying to have to queue for voting, for instance, or anything else where you have to wait physically. And we have a tendency to do the thing that's more convenient and not necessarily the thing that's more important. So I think technology can foster this tendency.
And I think those last two points really bring us back almost full circle to where we started, which was proof of concept. And, you know, how do we move on from proof of concept into something scalable and usable, and that works in a way for larger groups within the organization? And I think those points of the cognitive dissonance and also that convenience element means that we don't want to search for that extra why as to going back to that first step. We would rather build on the POC that we've seen and think that that's the way forward. So for me, that kind of just brings us back to where we started.
Yeah. Fighting our very nature, really. I mean, we have a lazy brain for quick second decisions that helped us survive, but it also is a big impediment towards seeking out the truth. It's too hard in many cases. Or it shouldn't be seen that way, but that's how it often is. We only have probably a few minutes left. I have to get on another call, but any final thoughts?
Just thanks for having me again. I appreciate it. And, you know, please reach out if you have any questions, concerns, and anything at all.
Yeah, awesome, Steve. Thanks very much. And you're always welcome to join us as one of the interrogators. So great.
Switch roles.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. No, this is great group, great conversation. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody here.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.